910, Big 550 KTRS. We are in luck and very excited about today's show because we have one of the best. He is a author of great historical history and biographies. He's H.W. Brands, and he's written a brand new book called The General and the President, MacArthur and Truman at the Brink of Nuclear War. H.W. Brands, welcome back to the Big 550 KTRS here in St. Louis.
Delighted to be with you.
Let's first start with Donald Trump, because Donald Trump has invoked General MacArthur a number of times in this election. Listen to Donald Trump. We had this worked in rehearsal.
Would find a general. Remember the old days of General MacArthur and General Patton and these great generals. Now, we must have somebody in there. General MacArthur is spinning in his grave when he sees what we do.
That is Donald Trump. So, H.W. Brands, the author of The General and the President, is it true, in fact, that General MacArthur is currently spinning in his grave?
I can't speak for General MacArthur in his grave, but I can say that if Donald Trump became president and Douglas MacArthur were not only serving under him, he would drive Donald Trump crazy because MacArthur did not listen to mere presidents.
You go back to the 1950s and Harry Truman and MacArthur and the great battle between the general and the president. What was it that you were looking for or you found that sort of excited you to write this book?
Well, the outbreak of the Korean War surprised the American people, surprised Douglas MacArthur, who was the American commander in the Far East, and surprised Harry Truman, the president. The United States very quickly went to the defense of South Korea against North Korea. And almost immediately, deep division arose between MacArthur and Truman. MacArthur believed that the war in Korea was just the beginning of a larger war in East Asia that was really essentially the beginning of World War III. Harry Truman wanted to keep the war in Korea isolated. So MacArthur wants it to get bigger. Truman wants to keep it small. MacArthur was, of course, the subordinate of Harry Truman, the commander-in-chief. MacArthur was a powerful figure, a celebrity in his own right. And he gave an increasing number of interviews. He made public statements. He wrote public letters criticizing the president's policy. Truman put up with this for a while, but eventually, when things got too confusing, when it looked as though MacArthur seemed to be overruling the president, Truman finally decided that MacArthur had to be fired. It was a bold decision. It was a decision that effectively ended Truman's political career. But nonetheless, it was a decision that has stood up to the test of history over the last 50 years.
Is it true, H.W. Brands, that Harry Truman wanted to meet the general and have a face-to-face conversation, and President Truman had to fly to see General MacArthur?
Oh, it was astonishing. MacArthur, at the end of World War II, refused to come back to the United States to brief the President of the United States. This is every other general did this. Dwight Eisenhower did this. All the other ones did. But MacArthur always said that he was too busy. His work was too important in Japan. He became head of the American occupation in Japan. And time and again, he put off Truman. And Truman just let it pass, in part because in the popular mind, MacArthur was a much bigger deal than Harry Truman. Truman was this accidental president. He had been a political hack in the Kansas City political machine, and he just accidentally became president. MacArthur, on the other hand, had earned all of the decorations that he won. He was this five-star general, this great figure. And Truman understood that if he gave an order to MacArthur to come home, MacArthur would probably defy the order. And then what would Truman do? So in the middle of the Korean War, Truman needs to talk to MacArthur because they need to come to some kind of understanding. And so Truman flies 14,000 miles to Wake Island in the Western Pacific. MacArthur can only come 2,000 miles. He says that's as far as he can go. Truman has lined up a full day of meetings, discussions, the whole thing. MacArthur, after 3 hours in the morning, stiffs the president and says, "I'm leaving. I got to go back to work." It was a slap in the face at the president of the United States. It was the kind of thing that MacArthur did all the time, and that for a while he could get away with.
So, looking back, only knowing this story from the history books, it seems like MacArthur had better PR than Truman, and Truman was afraid and held off on this final firing step because MacArthur was so popular with the American public. Is that true or false?
It's true, and it demonstrates that the constitutional chain of command is one thing. The president is commander-in-chief, and all officers in the military serve beneath him. But presidents also live in a political world. And if Truman tried to fire MacArthur, it would backfire on him very badly. He was already under heavy political attack from conservatives. And then to take on this hero of the conservatives, Douglas MacArthur, would have been more than he could stand politically. In fact, finally he did exactly that. And as I said, it ended his political career.
Looking back, though, MacArthur made some very critical mistakes, did he not? In terms of the war.
One of the odd things about Douglas MacArthur was he was considered this great hero, this celebrity among the American people as a whole. But almost everybody who served under MacArthur couldn't stand the guy, because every time one of his armies, one of his units won something, MacArthur raced in and claimed credit for it himself. So he was not beloved. He was not a GI's general. He was the public relations general. And this was the sort of thing that made things very difficult. But he had a couple of real blunders. He was commander of U.S. forces in the Philippines on the day of Pearl Harbor. And he got the news from Pearl Harbor 9 hours before the Japanese attacked him. 9 hours in which to get his forces ready, but he did absolutely nothing. The result was that the American force in the Philippines was decimated by the Japanese in what should not have been a surprise attack. He was surprised again at the outbreak of the Korean War, and he was most surprised when the Chinese entered the Korean War in the autumn of 1950. He had just weeks before assured President Truman that the Chinese would never enter the war, and if they did, they would be annihilated by MacArthur's forces. Well, they did enter the war, and they were not annihilated by MacArthur's forces. In fact, just the opposite.
I want to talk about this China thing you mentioned. How did he get that so wrong? Because in your book, The General and versus the President of MacArthur and Truman at the Brink of the War, he misses a couple of things. He also misses China's buildup, does he not?
He does. Part of the problem was that MacArthur surrounded himself with yes men, people who would simply tell him what he wanted to hear. As a result, once he developed an idea that China would never challenge me, because that's the way he looked at it, they'd be smart enough to stay away from me, then his subordinates, the people who should have had access to this intelligence, didn't want to contradict him. There were signs that China was getting ready to enter the war, that China, in fact, had already infiltrated volunteers into North Korea. But because MacArthur didn't want to hear it, and because these sorts of signals could be interpreted in various ways, they were interpreted in ways that corresponded with this notion that MacArthur already had. The result was that when the Chinese did enter the war in massive force, MacArthur was really thrown for a loop. It was one of those moments, rare moments in his career, when he just did not know what to do.
So was he a great general, or did he just have a great PR staff?
There were moments of brilliance. In fact, during the Korean War, the counteroffensive that he launched at Incheon in September of 1950 that circled around behind communist lines was one that was bold, it was daring. It succeeded precisely because it was so daring. The communist forces did not defend Incheon because it was understood that it would be so difficult to attack due to its high tides and other things that made an attack just very perilous. MacArthur said, that's exactly why I'm going to attack there. And he reversed the momentum of the war entirely. From almost losing the war, the United States and its allies almost won the war overnight. So he had these flashes of brilliance, but it was almost as though he was blinded by his own brilliance. He couldn't keep it up.
H.W. Brands, our guest, his new book is The General versus the President of MacArthur and Truman at the Brink of Nuclear War. H.W. Brands, so Harry Truman fires MacArthur. You say it ended his political career. He retires after that, and he retires with virtually very little popular support. And over the last 70 years or so, he has garnered much more support and is now a champion. People look to him as one of their political leaders. This is a classic example of only looking at history not at the current time, but through the lens of many decades, correct?
Oh, yes, and it's something that every president who leads under a cloud hopes for. George W. Bush is hoping that he can pull a Truman over the next 40 years. Because when Truman left office in 1953, he was the most unpopular president ever, more unpopular than Richard Nixon at the depths of the Watergate scandal. And Truman's popularity remained relatively low through the 1950s and 1960s. It was only with the American victory in the Cold War in the early 1990s that Truman really came into his current popularity, because the United States won the Cold War on Harry Truman's terms. Truman had said, if we hold on, if we're patient, if we don't lose our heads and start at World War III, we will win in the long run. MacArthur was saying, we need to fight World War III now. Truman was saying, no, no, no. And it was Truman who was finally vindicated by history that only decades after he made this fateful decision to fire MacArthur.
Yeah, and then MacArthur ran for president and went nowhere afterwards, right?
Oh, no, that was a great part of the story, too. In fact, there were people in Truman's administration who thought that maybe MacArthur was setting himself up to be fired so that he could come home and run for president. You know, in fact, he had already run for president twice, once against Franklin Roosevelt in 1944, once against Harry Truman in 1948. But clearly, he thought he would have made a better president than Truman. But what he didn't understand was that the American political culture needed somebody with a common touch. And what Truman had, what MacArthur didn't have, was a common touch. MacArthur had his talent, but he was aloof, he was arrogant. He was much better at being an emperor, which he effectively was in Japan as head of the occupation. As president of the United States, now he came home, and Americans discovered this guy does not have the common touch, but they found a general who did, Dwight Eisenhower, who was a hero in his own right, but also understood that you have to get people to like you, not simply just admire you. So Eisenhower became president, and MacArthur went off to a bitter retirement.
Wow. Great story. Great book. H.W. Brand's The General versus the President, where books are sold these days. MacArthur and Truman at the Brink of the War. H.W. Brand's, you're always welcome here. Thanks for stopping by.
Always a pleasure.
You got it. Thank you. 9:20.